Good day and thank you for joining Civilnet. Today my guest is John Judis, a well-respected American journalist, author, and a political analyst. He's received his BA and MA from the University of California at Berkeley and also founded and wrote an impressive series of critical political journals and has authored several books, one of which came out before the elections in America. He's currently serving as the editor-at-large for Talking Points Memo, leading website in the United States. Welcome to Armenia.
Happy to be here.
Well, unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to read your book, The Populist Explosion, How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics, but I've basically read everything on the web about your book, and this is a great chance to learn more about it. So this came out right before the elections, and
yes, it did.
These last elections in America, did they just give political analysts a bad name because no one was really able to put their fingers on what's happening?
When I was first negotiating with a publisher about the book in, let's say June of 2015, I had to talk them into allowing me to do the United States in addition to Western Europe, because all the populist movements seemed to be happening in France, Denmark, Spain, Greece, and you know, who knew what was happening in the United States? And within 2 months, you had both Trump and Sanders just exploded. And nobody expected either of them to go very far. Sanders was going to get, 5% if he was lucky of the electorate. Trump was going to make a stir, but then the respectable candidates would knock him out. So it was an amazing time. I mean, it was everything was surprising. Right up to the end.
So you say that both Sanders and Trump are populists.
Yes.
And you differentiate clearly between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, the central fact of populism is this conflict between the people and the establishment. And that's true of both. Sanders was talking about the billionaire class, or the 99% versus the 1%. So you had this idea of the people, all the people against the people at the top, the elite, the establishment. You get the same kind of thing from Trump. I went to his first, one of his first rallies in New Hampshire in August of 2015, and I expected a conventional Republican who's going to be talking about cutting taxes and eliminating the welfare state or what have you. And here was this guy railing against the Nabisco company, which makes these Oreo cookies, and was planning to move its plant from Chicago to Mexico and leave all these workers in the lurch. He was talking about corporations moving their headquarters overseas in order to avoid paying taxes in the United States. This is not something you hear from Republicans usually. So he had this kind of conflict going from what he called the silent majority and the forgotten Americans and the big corporations, the lobbyists in Washington. He said, well, I'm a billionaire, but that's a good thing because I can finance my own campaign.
Yes.
And if I weren't able to do that, the candidates would owe favors to all these lobbyists in Washington. So there was this whole dimension. The thing that was different about Trump from Sanders, or that's different from France's Front National, from Podemos in Spain, is that there was a third element for Trump. There was another people that the establishment was coddling, and in doing so, ignoring the needs of the middle America, of the forgotten Americans. And for him, a lot of that was illegal immigrants that were coming into the country, or Muslims. For some of our past politicians, it's been African Americans. In France, it's the Algerians.
But the issue, Trump continued talking about the immigrants, Muslims, but kind of this economic nationalism that you just mentioned that he started with wasn't persistent throughout his campaign, or was
absolutely persistent.
Was persistent.
You know, the thing about Trump that was odd was you'd go hear his speeches, and I heard a lot of them, and then the ones I didn't hear I would listen to on YouTube, and almost all the speech would be devoted to bad trade deals with China and Mexico, companies going overseas, some on our foreign policy, and then he'd always have a zinger. He'd always say, well, there's this fat woman, Rosie O'Donnell, and that would then get into the press. That would be the thing that was covered, and he did it on purpose, I think, because he knew that if he just talked about the other stuff, it wouldn't get covered on the nightly news. So there was always this element, and a lot of the press who actually aren't that interested in the economic issues, it just didn't cover it. But the people who went to the rallies heard it, they knew it. You know, it carried over to the idea of Make America Strong Again. Among some of the press, they had these wild interpretations that made Make America White Again or something like that. But he was talking about the change in America. In the 1950s, when he was a kid, and when I was a kid, you'd go into a store in America, and if something wasn't made in the USA, you wouldn't buy it. And that's not out of nationalism, it was because all the other products were junk. Japanese made these copies that would fall apart. 20, 30 years later, it completely reversed. You go into a store now and everything's made in China or Bangladesh, or if they're fancy goods, they're made in Japan. If they're fashion, they're made in Italy.
You usually choose the Japanese product.
Yes, and that's a big change. That's a shocking change for Americans of his generation, in my generation. And when a lot of what he meant when he's talked about making America great is, let's get back to the time when we make goods that people want to buy. And when we go into a store, we don't have to rely on all these cheap imports. So that was, again, that was a dimension that wasn't covered in the national news. But people who came from the Midwest, I'm also from the Midwest, manufacturing family, understood that immediately, and it resonated. So that's, again, the economic nationalism central to his appeal.
So the media is being blamed a lot for not covering correctly or not being what it's supposed to be, especially after these recent elections. Do you think the media actually played a large role in helping Trump become president-elect?
I don't think so. I mean, it made a lot, of course it had to play a large role. If he wasn't covered, it wouldn't have happened, but the media was very much on the attack as far as Donald Trump was concerned. And he knew it in a way, and he used it. Again, what I'm talking about with the zingers, those are the kind of things that somebody who was in the press corps from Washington, D.C. or from some fancy suburb would say, oh, that's going to kill his campaign, and so insulting this, you know, Rosie O'Donnell or some celebrity. But in fact, those were things that were popular, and they got covered. But, you know, the media did his videotape where he was boasting about his exploits of women. They also covered Hillary Clinton's emails, but it was, you know, it was about, I don't think the media itself was the deciding factor in the election.
If I'm not wrong, I understand that you predicted that probably Hillary would win, and also predicted political turbulence either way, but more so if Trump would become president.
Listen, that's no big deal. Everybody, you know, if you don't have if you're not omniscient in America, you rely on these polls. And there was only one poll that was done by the Los Angeles Times that was showing Trump ahead. So it wasn't really a prediction of mine. I was just reflecting what the polls said. And so, you know, everybody like me was surprised. I think even the Trump people didn't expect to win. They expected it would be very close. But they do much more extensive polling than the newspapers and the television networks.
But I was going to ask you, so the turbulence, it's a month has passed since, and he's gone back on a lot of promises, or has been persistent with a lot of what he said. So can we predict some of the turbulence that's still ahead politically, be it in America's internal politics or external politics?
There are about 4 or 5 different Donald Trumps, and it is hard to predict what he's going to do next. When he was in New York as a realtor, as a real estate developer, he was a moderate Democrat. He was for abortion rights. He wanted national health insurance. When he runs for president as a Republican, he changes a lot of those positions because he couldn't possibly win the primary if you're in favor of abortion rights, or if you want to preserve our national health care system. So he changed a lot. He says that climate change is a hoax during the election. There's a lot of states that depend upon coal and oil that wanted him to hear that kind of message. Does he really believe it? Well, he started to back away from some of those, but he can't back all the way because that's the base that elected him, and it also reflects what a lot of the Republican leadership thinks. So he's going to give them some things. He's going to give them probably a Supreme Court nominee who is opposed to abortion. He gave them an education secretary who is against the public education system, who wants to fund religious schools. Healthcare, I think that's a big test, what he'll do. Because if he starts to dismantle our healthcare system, especially for senior citizens, you won't see the Republicans controlling Congress in 2 years or 4 years.
Wasn't that one of the very first things he backed up? He said, Obama asked me not to touch the healthcare, so I probably won't.
He's equivocating. But he nominated somebody to be the head of the Health and Human Service Administration who does want to dismantle all these things. So I think that's a kind of third rail for him. That's a real danger zone. Foreign policy, again, it's a mystery. There are a few nominations that he made that are kind of ominous as far as I'm concerned. This fellow Flynn, who is the National Security Advisor, that's not the public representative of American diplomacy. That's the person who whispers in the president's ear, these are your options and this is what I recommend. He's known for characterizing the world as being divided in a conflict between the West and Islam. Not a conflict between the West and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but between Islam itself. There's another fellow, Bannon, who also thinks in that manner. That can lead us into some very bad things because we're going to be tested by ISIS, Al-Qaeda. There's no question in my mind that there are going to be terrorist incidents again in America. What will be his response? Will this same guy who says he wants to pull us out of the Middle East get involved in another quagmire like George W. Bush did, and Obama himself is not being able to extricate himself? So again, we just don't know, but from these kind of appointments are ominous.
So I think you said somewhere in one of the interviews I was reading that this is a completely new situation for America and it will disturb the status quo.
Well, what
that's been achieved, and I wanted to ask you about this. What did that status quo in America represent?
Well, look, I mean, there's all these different things that it can disturb, but the central thing about Trump is that we've had rich men in office before as president. John Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, they were all wealthy people, but they had inherited their wealth and they had no connection to particular business enterprises. They weren't businessmen at all. Trump is both the richest person we've ever had as president, and he's the first one to have a global network of economic interests that he is not going to dissociate himself from. He says, well, my children are going to run it, but I'm a parent myself, and if my children's future depended upon their businesses, I sure would worry about it. So, you know, in Armenia itself, you have questions because Trump has economic interests in both Turkey and Azerbaijan. Does that mean that he's going to be inclined less to ruffle their feathers than Armenia in the case you got into a conflict with those countries? So that's an unprecedented situation, and it invites all these kind of conflicts of interest.
Mr. Judis, you've been in Armenia for about a week by the invitation of the American Embassy, but today we're talking about your work, your studies. So did you have a chance to get a feel of the political situation in Armenia, of what's happening also in the context of these populist movements globally? To explain a little more, before your arrival, I was speaking with our editor-in-chief, and we were trying to figure out which of our political parties are populist, and we kind of decided that all of them are. In a political situation where the ruling party is a populist party and the oppositional parties are populist, where it's just clash of populist forces, what can be a possible outcome from that, or how does that work, or is there a precedent of that happening?
Look, one of my rules as a journalist is not to talk about things about which I have no expertise. And politics in Armenia is so high on the list. It's number 1A. So I wouldn't pretend to tell you anything about your politics here.
Well, let's pretend we're not speaking about Armenia in particular, but when the opposition is populist and the ruling party is populist, is there a precedent of this happening? And
well, look, in the United States we had left-wing and right-wing populists. But what I talked about in the book, look, the term populist does not have a definition that applies to all uses of the term. Putin is sometimes called a populist. Ronald Reagan is called a populist. The guy in Hungary is called a populist. I was talking about a particular tradition that was embedded in democracy. Started in the United States in the 1890s, sort of travels across to Europe in the 1970s. It's really not the same as populist parties in Eastern Europe, and it's probably not the same as populist parties here. So I wouldn't pretend to tell you what would happen in a situation where everybody claims to be populist. It can just be a synonym for popular, not populist.
Well, I think in Armenia's case, definitely, because the ruling party came into power in a way. Oh well, now we're talking about Armenian politics again.
No, look. Here's the thing: in what you find in the United States and Western Europe is that populist parties distinguish themselves by making demands upon the establishment that the establishment itself is unwilling to grant. Bernie Sanders, Medicare for everyone. That is our Medicare system, which would be way beyond what we have. Free college education for everyone. Now, those are things that you can have. I mean, Canada, Western Europe, but in the context of the United States, those created a strict demarcation, a frontier between those people that supported Bernie Sanders and the establishment, even in his own party. All right? So that's a characteristic of populism in the West, this kind of demand that separates off the people from an elite. If you have that here, it's very hard, it would be hard to apply, because if the people in the establishment are calling themselves populists, then it's not quite the same.
It's not quite working. I wanted to ask you about general political tendencies. Is there room for strong new ideologies in politics globally now? Because we've been lacking new and strong ideologies generally recently.
New and strong ideologies.
Yes.
I have to think about what you mean. I mean, I come out earlier in my life out of the socialist tradition. If you look at what's happened in Europe, that tradition of sort of left of center politics is really on the defensive. And it's been on the defensive for about 30 or 40 years. For instance, if you have a labor movement that's declining, that only represents 10% of the people, it's hard to imagine something like socialism. We're in a very kind of chaotic situation now. The news, the way people get information has changed. The social media is both, on the one hand, a source of intellectual pollution, because you get all these crazy ideas about space aliens, for instance. But on the other hand, it democratizes everything. People have more access over information and strange things like trade agreements that before only 10 people, let's say in my town of Washington, understood. So again, it's a time of great change. It's not necessarily a time where things have cohered into particular new ideologies. And it's still a time when the old ideologies, particularly of socialism on the left, hardline conservatism on the right, are under attack, are under question.
Well, another question that I've read about and heard about, but I wanted to hear your opinion. There's this opinion that Trump was elected because of this underlying current of racism, sexism, even fascism in America. Is that something that was, in your opinion, played a role in his election?
Look, we've always had people who are racist and sexist or whatever in the United States.
Well, the idea was that there was more of these people, and they.
Well, let me continue. We had explicitly racist movements in the United States. George Wallace in the 1960s was a racist. Segregation now and forever was his slogan. That's what it was about. The Donald Trump campaign was not about race. You could say, you could get these, genius psychologists and say, well, unconsciously it was about race, but it was not. That was not part of the appeal that Trump was explicitly making. When he talks about make America great again, and that's why I made fun of this idea. He was not talking about make America white again. He was talking about, again, goods, manufacturing, bringing back the country that existed 30, 40 years ago. But that wasn't a white country. It was a country that made things. So again, I'm sure there were racists that supported him. But that didn't define the campaign. And that's not why it emerged at the time it did. Again, it's a product of the Great Recession. And if you look, for instance, at where America lost manufacturing jobs in the last 15 years, there's almost a perfect match between those states and the states that Trump wasn't supposed to win, but ended up winning.
So probably not President Trump, but who or what would make America great again? Or America doesn't have that problem?
Oh, I don't know. I'm very sympathetic to the kind of economic nationalism that he put forth. I'm not saying I'm sympathetic to him. I'm very worried about his administration, but I think we have to get back the ability to manufacture things ourselves. I'm not saying that it will bring millions of jobs, because we have automation. But we need to have a better trade deficit, less of a trade deficit. We need to have a situation where the most profitable kinds of manufacturing are done in the United States, so we have a surplus on which to support our social welfare state and our citizens who don't necessarily work in the most profitable jobs. There's all kinds of benefits that could come from that. So I'm certainly in favor of that side, and I hope he does something about it.
Okay, on this note, on a relatively positive note, thank you very much for being here and for this conversation. And I also thank the viewers. I hope you found the conversation interesting.